welcome to Coffee with Kelly. And welcome to the Crisis Go podcast. I'm your co-host, Ethan Woodman, product marketing specialist here for Crisis Go. And we're joined by the Kelly Moore, who's had many significant roles in his lifetime, one being a commander from the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office. He's now retired from that role and continues to see safety in schools improved by working for Crisis Go as their school safety analyst. In this episode, we'll be exploring the federal guidelines and the crucial elements that make up a solid safety program. From prevention and mitigation to response and recovery, we'll uncover the systems, policies, and people that keep our schools safe. Join us as we take a deep dive into the inner workings of a school safety ecosystem and hear real-life stories from a seasoned commander. Get ready for an informative and exciting journey into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly. Upon your initiative on our last podcast, I looked up cowboy coffee. I was initially kind of excited, but then as I looked more into it, I realized that was probably not going to be for me. The way I drink my coffee is I actually put a paper filter in my metal filter. So my coffee is like double filtered, which is kind of the opposite of cowboy coffee.
Oh, it's completely opposite.
Yep.
So you're a coffee snob is what you're saying.
I'm not as much of a coffee snob as I want to be. I did get a milk frother for Christmas, so that's been put to use already.
Nice.
I put a little like caramel in the milk before you froth it, so then the milk froth has like a caramel flavor to it.
I thought you said you liked it black last time.
I do like it black, but sometimes, I like to treat myself.
Okay.
All right, Kelly. So we released our most recent blog, and this was a really good one. I truly enjoyed this one. We talked about the 3 pillars. So do you want to give just a brief summary of what those pillars are?
Yeah, of course. The 3 pillars are what I think is necessary to have a solid, valid school safety program. And those pillars are systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Might have a little bit different definition than most people are immediately thinking of. Policies that drive what we do, set expectations, compliance, and so forth. And the people. And oftentimes we are looking at the systems and the policies to tell us what we do or to take care of what we need to do as people. And we forget about how important the people are. We've talked about this a little bit before in the last podcast. I think we talked about we can make your schools look like a prison, right?
Yep.
And if you have enough money, we can have that kind of access controls at schools and put all of those systems into place. The problem is we know that in prisons, we have every crime that's occurring out in society occurring in the prison. You name it, it occurs in the prison itself. So the common failure point is the people. Either they're not monitoring the people who come in, they're not searching them correctly, they're, in some cases, assisting people bringing in contraband, etc. So we really need to focus on those people. Now, we call those the 3 pillars: systems, people, and policies. But we have to look at those 3 pillars in the context of what FEMA looks to as what is a solid emergency plan and an emergency response program. And that includes prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So all of our school safety programs, systems, policies should look at putting those things into place under that context of what FEMA says we should be doing.
It's interesting that most of those steps are occurring before or during, a crisis. The steps aren't after. There's one step after, it's recovery, but there's 4 steps. So that should tell you that most of your work should be beforehand.
Right. but it's also responses in response to the incident, right? So it's,
Yep.
you have that triggering episode, whatever that is, and then you have your response to that and the recovery from that. But you're right. A lot of the work goes long before you ever have an incident. And we talk about it in the second blog related to this podcast. We talk about the prevention, when that starts, and we talk about active shooters and what the suspects are saying regarding their reason why. And typically that reason, whatever that injustice was, started years before the decision to perpetrate this sort of tragic event.
Now, when we're talking about these steps, and it's easy to relate it to kind of like that extreme of a school shooting, are these steps easier for preparing for a lesser tragic event, or do they all kind of roll in together?
So it's necessary to prepare for the worst case scenario and hoping for the best, right?
Yep.
And so in school safety, we often have a timeline related to an incident. And that incident starts at that triggering event, whatever that is, right? Whether it's a fire, an earthquake, a act of violence, anything like that. That's when our timeline usually starts. But in the context of preparation and prevention and mitigation, you have to do that long before that triggering event, right? And so when we walk into a school every day, currently most people say, okay, this is a normal school day. We're not thinking of anything occurring, right? But the reality is, if we're doing school safety correctly, we're always in some operational phase that's related to one of these four categories: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. We're always in some sort of phase there. If your normal day begins and everything is normal and operational, you should be thinking one of two phases there, right? Prevention. I want to keep it this way. I want to make sure nothing happens. I want to make sure everything's safe, everything's secure. I want to make sure nothing happens. I want to prevent it. If I can't prevent it, I want to make sure I mitigate it. Do something that's going to decrease the impact should something happen. Maybe I want to prepare. Maybe I want to train. Maybe I want to have a tabletop exercise, something like that. There should be something you're doing related to having safety in the forefront, right? That way, when something does happen, we talked about this in the last podcast. If something does happen, you're prepared to say, okay, this could happen, and now I can respond and eventually recover from this response, whatever that means related to the situation. When we look at that, then we look at the fact that we're always in a phase. And when you're talking about phases, and we're talking about districts, not just a single school, because a single school may be in preparation, but when you're talking about a district with multiple buildings, you may have multiple schools in different phases, and you might have different schools that are in all of those phases, some of those phases, or one of those phases at any given time. So that's where your safety team at the district level should be looking at, the status of your district. When they come into work in the morning, what's the status of our district? Who's in what phase? Hopefully everyone's in that prevention mitigation phase, right? But it's something that you have to prepare for. You have to look at from the very beginning. Today, we have to look at, are we ready? If we're not, what are we going to do to get ready? And what are we doing to prevent? Are we looking at the kids on the playground? Is there any bullying occurring? We have to look at social media and those things, anything happening there, because what we're doing is preventing something that may occur years down the road.
You know what this kind of reminds me of is when you're driving down the road or you're walking down a walking path, let's say, and you see there's there's always like a sign outside of a fire department, and it'll always tell you what your fire danger level is. It always say, your risk is high, your risk is low. So right off the bat, you already know, okay, today, like, I'm set. Like, I don't have to worry about doing a bonfire in my backyard.
Right.
It's almost like schools need a sign that they can edit and have like that, hey, we're in the prevention mitigation phase right now, just so people are like reminded as soon as they walk through the door of like, and kind of list the steps of like, what does it mean to be in this phase? Like, make sure you're looking out for open doors, make sure you're looking out for suspicious people walking through the door that don't belong, something like that.
Yeah, of course. So, we talk about ecosystems when we talk about school. If you're really looking at this total picture, in order to have a safe school, you have to have this school safety ecosystem. And if you look at it in the context of a traditional ecosystem like a pond, right, or a lake is in and of itself an ecosystem. But there's so many different elements in there that support that ecosystem that are related to each other. And if you remove something from that ecosystem, the equilibrium of that system is altered. But you're right. We need to have that sort of connective tissue to all of these disparate systems that we have out there. And some of those systems are actually processes and policies, right? The people, the typicals. When we talk about systems, we often think of alarm systems, PA systems, monitoring systems, sensors, door lock systems, and access control, visitor management, information systems, right? But if they're all working independently, then they become cumbersome and people don't use that information. And just the other day, I mentioned this in one of the blogs. I had a conversation. It's a national organization that I belong to. It's called Zero Now. And there's a lot of conversations going on about school violence. How do we prevent that? And the question that was posed to the group, it was this: can metal detectors prevent what occurred in Virginia a week or so ago, where a 6-year-old came in to the school with, I think it was his mother's firearm, and shot a teacher? And the question was, if that school had a metal detector, would it have prevented that incident from occurring? And the answer to that is maybe.
Right. Maybe.
That's what the metal detectors are there for, right?
Yep.
But as people started talking about that, responding to that question, then you have to start saying, okay, is that what we want? Do we want all of our kids going through a metal detector? Maybe. I don't know. That's for the schools to decide. If you are going to have somebody or a metal detector, you need somebody monitoring it so that when it goes off, they can grab the kid and say, what do you have in your backpack, or what do you have on you that's setting this off? Are you willing to have that line build up and so forth? And the point of this is, some people were saying, I know a school who bought a metal detector, but it was going off too much and they unplugged it. So yeah, it could prevent it if it's used properly, if you have people there monitoring it, if they're, challenging the kid when they go through the metal detector. I mean, I don't know of very many places nowadays where there are large gatherings, sporting events, things like that. I don't know of many places that don't use some sort of metal detector.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm going to a sports thing and I go through a metal detector, I'm not like offended of like,
no,
oh man, like I hate having to do this. It's like, I'm glad that they have this so that I feel moderately safe in this event.
Right. The systems are only as good as the information that you get out of them, right? The system beeps every time a large chunk of metal goes through, hence the name metal detector, right?
Now, I'm going to interrupt you.
Yep.
Can you adjust a metal detector? Like, let's say, because obviously kids are walking into a school and they probably have like 3 ring binders or something of that nature in their backpack. Like, is it just like a user error that maybe in that event that you were talking about where it was going off too many times? Did they Is there a point where you just have it set too low and it's going off at little things?
Yeah, so most of them can be adjusted, right? You've never seen a sporting event, as an example, allow you to take your bag through the metal detector.
Well, yeah.
You open it up and look.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Or you put your keys in a little bucket or a bowl and they look at it and slide it through. And then if it goes off, they'll probably send you over to secondary screening where they have like a handheld and they'll try to find out exactly what set it off, right? Belt buckle, you forgot your keys in your pocket or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So they're only as good as the people monitoring.
Do schools, like, I don't know if this sounds corny or not, but like, could a school like make that experience more fun for, let's say, like an elementary school? Like, can we dress up the metal detectors so it's kind of like a fancy looking gate, you know, like entryway kind of thing? Like, oh, welcome to so-and-so school. Kind of not make it so, you know, as you would say, prison-like.
Sure, you can do lots of things, but metal detectors are pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
You walk through it in it, but you can make them less intrusive, I guess.
Yeah.
But it really becomes educating people why.
Okay.
And getting them used to going through that process. You know, people say it takes too long to get the kids in. Look, we're talking stadiums that do hundreds of thousands of people, right?
Yeah.
I think we can spend 30 minutes getting people into the school.
Just wake them up earlier.
Yep. Bring them in, get them there on time.
Yep.
Yep.
Now, what we're talking about, basically kind of what we've been talking about is, you know, your metal detectors and such won't really be effective if there's not someone to man it, essentially. In our recent blog that was posted, you do another one of your Kelly stories around a drone, basically, that they wanted to do a drone, but then no one wanted to take the time to actually learn how to operate it. Do you feel that in the K-12 industry, that would hiring more people and have their job solely be devoted to like manning these devices, like would that be the answer, or would the answer be to just educate the people that are already there on how to use these systems? What's the answer there?
The answer is whatever system you have, you need to have somebody that is competent in its use, right? And we talk about the people, right? And part of that metal detector story was it was going off too much. Well, is the metal detector faulty, or are the people who are manning it, is that not their function and they're worried about something else, right? So in the drone story, I'll just give that real quick. I was asked as part of the management team to research and start a drone program for our sheriff's office. And so I started working through the cost figures and so forth. And it turned out quite a bit more money than what the executive staff had thought. And they were questioning me about this. And I said, well, you need to hire people for this. And they said, why don't we use the people we have? And I said, well, you can, but there's a cost to that too. And it a little bit different in the education environment. But the SWAT team was the one that asked for this program to be put into use. And I said, okay, so if you want to reduce the cost of personnel, then we need to use the people you already have to operate the system. And the FAA requires at least 2 people running the system. So I need 2 of your highly trained SWAT officers to work the drone. And they have to be trained to the standard of the FAA. And they said, well, you can't have my people. Well, I said, then you don't get the drone. The drone program has to be run. And the point of that is they wanted it because it was this cool little, quote, toy, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, for every toy you guys have, you have to have somebody operating it. And that's the same with school systems, right? Whether it's a fire alarm, a metal detector, a access control, somebody has to be responsible for playing with that toy. They have to understand its use. They have to know when it alerts you and gives you information, what that means, right? And we get into those threat assessments. What does that mean? When do we do them? Who does them? What happens if? Those types of questions. Your threat assessment and behavior intervention programs are systems within your school safety program. And if you don't understand what's occurring on the playground, in first, second, third grades and what's occurring there and the effect that they have on people through the years that fester for years into the high school years, you're missing a huge opportunity. And so for everything that we have, every function that we create, we have to have somebody who's responsible to make sure that that function is completed to satisfactory. And in the blog, I talked really quickly about Incident Command System, ICS. A lot of people are scared by what that means and what it is. But the bottom line is when we're talking about incident management, we're talking about identifying what needs to be done, what functions need to be done to meet our objectives to resolve this incident. And if I identify a function, then I need somebody who is responsible for completing that function. If I identify a function and I have nobody to complete that function, the responsibility becomes mine to complete that function, right? That's the whole basis for this incident command monster that people are afraid of. It's identifying what needs to be done and assigning somebody to complete that function so that we can resolve what we need. That's the whole basis for your safety program is what am I going to need to do to keep my school safe? What are the functions? What are the policies that are going to drive the completion or the prevention, mitigation, response, preparedness? How often am I going to get trained? And you work through those. What am I going to need? If I had a fire, what do I need to do? If I had an active violence incident, what do I need to do? Who needs to be involved? When you're asking and answering those questions, you're creating your program.
Do you think that when districts or schools are not investing in various security systems, do you think that the motive is that they don't do it because they know they need someone to operate it?
I'm sure that's a consideration. I think that the driving force is one of two things, and they're often together. Funding.
Okay. Yep.
Funding is a big issue, right? It shouldn't be now because there is so much money out there over the last few years, especially with all the COVID relief and the mental health stuff. There's a ton of money available. So that really shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
But the other thing is the time and not understanding the roles and responsibilities. I guess that's three things, right? But It really is. I often talk about what frustrates me in the school safety arena. And this is almost universal, regardless of who I'm talking with, that in order for us to get a district to move to make something safer for them, they wait for a mandate. They wait for some law to be created. Some you shall do this mandate that's come down from either the national level or the state level. Sometimes it's a local level, but they wait for the mandate. And, I know you and I have talked about this. We're 24 years, just shy of 24 years past Columbine. And our schools are still waiting for people to tell them what to do.
It's crazy.
And we're still getting that response. I'm not a safety guy. Well, you are. That's part of your role. That's part of your mandate as a teacher, as an educator, as a school official, is the welfare and safety of our children that I drop off at your school to be educated.
Yeah. I mean, I feel pretty strongly about that, safety should be number one priority, even above education. I understand that schools are their main goal that they have is to educate children, but I'm not a parent yet. But if I was dropping a kid off at school, I would rather know that they're safe than educated. If the school could tell me that they're always going to be safe, that would be more important to me than them being educated. So
in Maslow's hierarchy, safety and security is right there at the top, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Fundamentally, that's what's there. When we talk about safety and we talk about why isn't it a bigger priority, we talked a little bit about this in the last blog about the incongruity of the statement, safety is our number one priority versus their actions. And, I think there's probably a lot more effort than there was a couple of years ago, but not the effort that I think is needed. And I think I talked a little bit, I think, about it in the last blog, but I had my boss at the school district I was the safety coordinator for. I asked her what her goals were for her students and to reach their potential, essentially was the response to that. And I said, but they can't do that if they're worried about their safety.
Right.
Right. And we talked about that. And I think they go hand in hand, but we still struggle on getting the time to train our teachers, the processes in which we need to train our staff. We still struggle with those. And we need to make that a priority. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in February about creating that safety culture. But frankly, there shouldn't be a policy. There shouldn't be a decision. There shouldn't be a curriculum that is developed and implemented that somebody doesn't ask this question. How does this affect the safety of our schools and children?
Mm.
A lot of the answers to that question, a lot of them are going to say it really doesn't. Okay, great. Move on. But you need to ask that question.
Interesting. Okay. That's a great point for sure. And so you've kind of transitioned here into policies, and you kind of dove into this a little bit in the last blog, and some points that when I think about policies, you talk about, policies give authority to enforce expectations. So kind of like one of my questions is, you could have an absolutely lousy policy and that would have a pretty negative effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be some thought into the policy. You can't just create a policy for the sake of saying, I created a policy.
Mm-hmm.
Like there needs to be some thought behind it.
Some effort. Yeah.
Yeah.
Policies drive everything that teachers do, right? The culture of the district drives what people do. The culture is created by policy, and the culture is the things that people do within the school every day without being told they need to do it. But that was because the policy says they're used to the policy. They're used to this is what we're going to do, right? So we need to drive our safety programs through policy for a lot of reasons, because if somebody violates a policy, then we can deal with that. If they're not performing within accordance to the policy, or they didn't get trained within the limitations or the parameters of the policy, then we can deal with that. If you don't have a policy and you don't have this directive guidance for your staff, you're going to wait till somebody says, here's your mandate. Or you're going to wait till the court says you owe $100 million because you failed to provide a safe environment for your kids.
For the people that are writing these policies, let's say there's someone who's not as experienced as you, I guess I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say they honestly just don't know where to start. How would they go about writing a policy to ensure the safety of their school?
So the first step in writing a policy is getting a piece of paper and start writing, right? Nowadays it's a computer, right? But get the people who have expertise. They may not be, nationally recognized experts, but let's talk to our law enforcement people. Let's talk to our fire guys. Let's talk to our security people. What would you do in this case? How do you think we should respond to this? How often should we train? Who should be trained? When should they be trained? Those types of things. They're easy questions. What are your expectations? We expect our kids to be safe. How? Well, we're going to have a single point of entry. There should be a policy for that so that you can take this to your parents, your community, and say, our policy has now changed. You have to enter through the front door of the school every morning. All of the perimeter doors are going to be secured, period. You've set that expectation, and now everyone understands that. There are model policies out there at both the state, national levels, often at the county, regional levels as well. So don't reinvent the wheel, as they say, but it's inappropriate for most people to just take somebody else's policy and say, here it is.
Mm.
Implementing a policy that you don't understand, or that you don't enforce, or that you don't live by yourself as a district is almost as bad, if not worse, than not having a policy at all.
That is such a good point. Do you feel that occurs sometimes, that one district, whatever, will look up a policy that's from another district and just kind of read it over and say, yeah, that sounds about right, and then just implement it?
Yep. Happens all the time.
Huh. Wow.
In fact, most of the national level policies will have a watermark over it, so you can't do that. So at least you have to retype it so that you understand what's in the policy.
So let's say a school has written their own policy from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say they've done all the right things. With marketing, you have like an editing phase basically, or a review phase. Who's part of reviewing that policy?
So, and that's a great question. This shows the relationship of practice versus policy, right? People versus policy. So I have a policy that's written. We get a committee together and we write a safety policy. It's probably a collection of several different policies affecting different things, different subsections of the safety policy. But your policy should be trained and implemented, communicated, all of those things so that everyone understands what that policy means and what the expectations are. So I have a safety policy that says I will conduct drills every Monday, right? Not a good policy. So I start doing that and I find out that that's not a good policy. So I have feedback from my school saying, look, we're adhering to the policy. We're doing these drills every Monday, but we have to do them at the same time because our Mondays are already booked with stuff. It's just Mondays, right? So we need to be able to, if you want us to do weekly policies or weekly drills, then we need to be able to pick and choose when we do those so that we can get a wider breadth of knowledge and experience, right? So that after action review goes up to the policymakers and they change their policy, right? So they should be reviewed often, at least annually. But when you're doing your drills or exercises or you have an incident and the policy needs to be refined, it should be done then.
Okay. What kind of event would trigger that? I mean, obviously, an active shooter would obviously trigger that, but would a bullying situation trigger that?
If the policy was a hindrance to an effective assessment and intervention, then that policy needs to be changed.
Okay.
So if you have a policy, I'll give you a very bad one, is if you have a bullying incident and you require that the quote bully to go sit on the bench in the play yard.
Yeah.
Quickly, that bench will be known as the bully bench.
Yeah.
Right? So if that's your policy, the bully bench is going to be created. Some of the kids will use that as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Some kids will take that as a badge of disgrace, right? So bad policy. So we need to change that, right? How do we effectively stop that child from bullying? And how do we break that cycle of bullying so that they understand that their behavior is not appropriate without shaming them?
Because I mean, that's kind of the underlying thing is that there's probably something either internally going on or could be something going on in the home that's causing a child to act in that manner.
Right.
So trying to help resolve that is really going to help you more in the end and help the kid in the end, more importantly.
Yeah, exactly. In the most recent blog, I address a threat assessment behavior intervention scenario. And I'll go over that real quick. I know we're running short on time, but that incident was I got a call from an elementary school principal that wanted to know how to proceed with the following incident. A parent of one of her students was demanding that a first grader be essentially arrested and removed from school. And I said, okay, what's the deal? What are the circumstances? So the reporting parent accused this first grader of threatening to kill her fourth grade daughter. And I said, okay, that's kind of extreme, right?
Yeah.
And I said, that's usually not something a first grader even really thinks about. So let's delve into this. And I said, so give me the incident. Give me the circumstances. So turns out the first grader and a group of her friends were playing kickball. And through the course of that kickball game, the ball ended up where the fourth grade girls were and interrupted whatever it was that they were doing. And the fourth grader picked up the ball and said, you don't get the ball back. And the first grade girl, after pleading, give us the ball back. We want to play our game for several minutes, I'm told. Finally says, if you don't give me that ball, I'm going to kill you. And as you can imagine, the fourth grader went and told the teacher. And that's the incident, right? And I said, okay. So I told the principal that she needed to do a threat assessment on both kids. And when I say threat assessment, I'm talking about threat and behavior. Because part of a threat assessment is identifying concerning behaviors. And the role of a threat assessment is not to determine whether or not there is a threat, but is there concerning behavior that can lead to a threat? Or if there is a threat, what is the level of that threat? And how do we intervene to mitigate or prevent that threat from being carried out? And the principal said, are you kidding? You want me to do a threat assessment on a first grader? And I said, no, I said both girls. And why? I said, look, we have the incident. The fourth grader has the ball and she's coming there from a position of power. She's bigger. She's older. She's got her little posse behind her and she's coming from the position of power. Anytime that you come from a position of power to force somebody to do something else that they don't want to do, that's bullying.
Yeah.
Right? So fourth grader is bullying the first grader. In response to that bullying, the first grader didn't act like the fourth grader thought she would. In order to take the power away, she made the threat of violence. So now you have a fourth grader who is bullying a first grader that says, yeah, not today, sister, and makes the threat. If you want to stop that bullying cycle, then you need to address the behavior of both students. The first grader obviously acted inappropriately. The fourth grader also acted inappropriately, but is playing the victim card. I'm the victim here. I was the one. But your actions caused that threat to be made. And if you don't address that, then that animosity is going to go on for years between those two. And like I said, I think I've said previously, the number one reason stated by suspects within the active shooters who lived was they were bullied. If we don't address bullying at the earliest stages, we're missing out. We're missing that opportunity.
I'm going to have to find that statistic. I'm sure it's probably on the FBI website or something. And I know we're running short on time, but you can just maybe do a yes or no question. We can talk about it more later on in a future episode. But when you're doing a threat assessment on kids in that scenario, would their parents also be a part of that threat assessment?
Depends on the circumstances.
Okay.
I mean, you're going to let them know that you're doing it and why you're doing it. You want their involvement, but oftentimes the kid's behavior is a learned behavior from home.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to.
Yeah, so you have to address the home environment as well in lots of cases.
That opens up a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, we can do a whole podcast on that.
That would be very interesting for sure.
Sure would be.
All right. Well, Kelly, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief high level of what we talked about, what are the key takeaways of our discussion today?
The key takeaways are the three pillars, right? You need systems, you need people, you need policies. If you take one of those away, then you're likely going to have a system that fails when you need it most, right? So there's this relationship between those three pillars. You can't, I said this to a bunch of teachers a couple of years ago, and I was surprised when people didn't know what the fire triangle was. The fire triangle is, in order to have combustion, an actual fire, you need heat, fuel, and oxygen. If you take one of those components away, you can't have fire. Scientifically, you can't have it. So when I look at the three pillars of systems, people, and policies, if you take one of those components away, your safety system is going to fail. It may not be readily noticeable, but it's going to fail. And it's going to fail when you need it most. It's not just having systems. It's not just having people. It's not just having policies. It's having all of those work together, the relationships. One of the things we didn't really touch on is the relationships between the people who need to help you keep your school safe. And we're talking about the first responders. We're talking about law enforcement, fire, medical staff, and just community partners. The time to start the relationship is long before you need them to be involved with your safety program. And if you think that you're going to be effective when you hit a panic button, and the first time the officer that is coming to save you from whatever caused you to press that panic button is the first time they've ever been at your building, if you think you're going to be hugely successful, you've got another thing coming, right? It's going to take that officer time just to find where they're at. So relationships of understanding what it is that they're going to do when you call them, and for them understanding what you're going to do and when you're going to call them and under what circumstances, who's in charge of what, when, those types of things, that has to be done long before you actually need them. And it's those relationships that will help you if you don't know where to start. Call up the local fire department, call up the local police or sheriff's office, have them come and let's sit down and talk. I want to make our school safer. How do we do that? And they're going to give you different perspectives from their own area of expertise. You take that, you write it down, you start writing your policies, you start writing your plans, your emergency operations plans, those types of things, and then you review it, adjust as needed. And if you do that, you're well on your way. But remember, our last podcast talked about lifelong learners and it being a process. This is part of that process. It's a continual process. It never ends. As long as you are kicking about your learning process and keeping people, yourselves, your family, your students, your staff, your community safe, never stops. It's something that we always have to have on the front of our mind.
Thank you for joining us on this episode. We hope you found the information and insights shared to be valuable and informative. Remember, keeping our schools safe is a collaborative effort and requires a comprehensive approach that involves systems, policies, and people working together. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we'll continue to explore the important topic of school safety. Please make sure to click that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to get notified of future episodes. Also, check us out on crisisgo.com, where you'll find all of our podcasts, blogs, and solutions to help keep your school safe.